And thank you for having me here and an opportunity to present to you all on illustrating your research. So arts-based approaches to knowledge mobilization as part of the APELS webinar series. And I will start off with a quick land acknowledgement. So I am thankful that I live, work, and play in Amaskwachiwaskahigan, which is Edmonton, located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. I'm committed to learning as well as appreciating and respecting the people, histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich and educate our vibrant community. So I do confess this is an ongoing journey for me. I'm originally from the Caribbean. I've been here for about 30 years. Don't mean to age myself there, but like in the Caribbean, our history was rife with the annihilation of the Carib peoples that were indigenous to all islands and nations of the West Indies. I was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago in particular. And I am a descendant from indentured slaves that were brought from East India, China, and Spain. So my own family history is steeped within the struggles of emancipation and sovereignty as a nation, having excavated ourselves from British colonial rule. And truly throughout this journey, I get to learn something new every day. This has tremendously influenced my work and appreciation of the freedoms that we have, and just contributed to the mindfulness and the meaningfulness of that journey towards reconciliation. So I am a knowledge mobilization specialist. I also like to call myself a visual alchemist. And I mean, this is kind of what qualifies me to be here to talk to you all about illustrating your research. So in addition to being that knowledge mobilization specialist, I have a background in business analysis, visual communication designs, graphic recording and facilitation, artistry. I'm a purveyor of communications, both digital and analog, and a subject matter expert in a lot of different fields, including cake artistry, which is kind of a side thing. And then, yeah, operating as a facilitator, but then also on the personal side of things, I'm a caretaker and have both lived and living experience in patients as a patient and inpatient care. I will also give an art and illustration acknowledgement. We are talking about art today, and I promise to take you on a visual journey, not just with examples, but with a special guide. So I'd like to introduce you to Kim. So it's KMB with a silent B. And Kim's going to be guiding us through a lot of these slides today. So just to go over the learning objectives, the session will take you on a visual journey through various forms of graphic illustration in research and when and why it should be used, right? So we'll blaze through what defines knowledge mobilization. We'll talk about arts-based research and arts-based knowledge mobilization, and then we'll trailblaze our way through considerations and challenges in those arts-based approaches, right, to knowledge mobilization. That's really going to help you craft engaging illustrations for your audiences to achieve that meaningful and impactful dissemination. So we'll go through a quick introduction to knowledge mobilization for those of you that may not know it so well, because it is, I guess, it's got a different dimension to it now. A lot of you may be familiar with knowledge translation, right? That's the term traditionally used. There are various other terms that have kind of floated around over the years, KT being that most commonly used one. Knowledge translation is defined as a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge to improve the health of Canadians and provide that more effective health services and products and strengthen the healthcare system. So that's sort of the definition that CIHR has given us. This process takes place within a complex system of interactions between researchers and knowledge users, which may vary in intensity, complexity, and level of engagement, depending on the nature of the research and the findings, as well as the needs of the particular knowledge user. But then when you look a little closer at knowledge mobilization, we define this as the transfer, exchange, and co-creation of knowledge between researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and the public, right, who we define as knowledge users, to inform decision-making, improve practice, and foster innovation. So the pandemic changed the context and really encouraged more human-centric approaches. As the context changed, we needed ways to connect a little better. This increased the emphasis of knowledge mobilization in more recent years, right? Due to that realization that failure to use available evidence is costly and harmful. So this also helps to shift the focus to I ideas, which is indigeneity, inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice. So in a health setting in particular, where failure to use evidence can lead to overuse of unhelpful care, underuse of effective care, and errors in execution, there's that increased pressure for individuals and organizations to demonstrate the impact of research. So KMB, or knowledge mobilization, has stepped up and emerged in response to these pressures, right? Producing new knowledge, and this contributes positively to those real-world issues that we're facing. It bolsters informed policy and decision-making and patient user experiences. So to demonstrate those particular outcomes, a systematic approach to mobilizing knowledge is needed, hence knowledge mobilization is considered broader and more capable than KT. So I like to talk about it in terms of evolution, right? And my lovely Pokemon example here. And just to kind of demonstrate, it's like knowledge mobilization is that next evolution or next stage of KT in that sense. Knowledge mobilization focuses on the impacts of change in behavior and thinking. So it's more people focused rather than solutions focused. And again, that's because our contexts have changed and evolved over the years. And CIHR recognizes this humanization of our contexts that have now moved to the forefront of research. So knowledge mobilization has those deeper roots in human-centered design thinking approaches, which has led to that shift in its use over knowledge translation. And it really does appropriately reflect actionable movement of evidence to practice that is user-focused and user-driven to produce the best outcomes. It creates that linkage and exchange of information rather than just the sharing or push or pull of interpreted information. And I know this might seem a little overwhelming in terms of the text, but what I want you to focus on here in this particular knowledge spectrum visual is you'll see that knowledge dissemination like has those components. It moves, it's got that linear dissemination of knowledge from producer to user to more of that co-production of knowledge, social learning, and innovation. Right, there's three desired outcomes when we look at the knowledge spectrum, and that's to inform, engage, and act. So knowledge mobilization serves those three basic functions in being informational, relational, and systems focused, with each function kind of building on the ones before. So enabling dissemination and access to information is the most basic function of knowledge mobilization, and that's the focus of inform. The second function of knowledge mobilization involves helping others to make sense of the information, improving knowledge use and decision-making, and fostering co-production. So it's a relational function where you'll see a lot of engagement happen. So it's called engage. And then the most complex function of knowledge mobilization is aimed at broad innovation and systems change, behavior change, and builds on both the informational and relational functions. And that's the focus of ACT. And then within that, you can see how it transitions from knowledge creation and knowledge synthesis, so that sort of linear dissemination of knowledge, through knowledge dissemination, which is sometimes referred to as end-of-grant knowledge translation for some of you that are more familiar with that term. And then the engagement and collaboration, which is more like the integrated knowledge translation, and then into action and implementation, where you can like really see that impact of the knowledge mobilization. So then who is knowledge mobilization for? We use the term knowledge users in particular. We have shifted away from the term stakeholders because of that being a very colonial and not ideas focused term. We define it as those researchers, practitioners, policymakers, anybody really in the broader community, patients, those with lived experiences. It could be your end users, your target audiences. It's just a way of referring to the individuals and groups that you want to act as a result of your knowledge mobilization efforts, or who are going to make use of your research knowledge. And then when you see that like um, broad spectrum of even the knowledge users that are being targeted, you can see how knowledge mobilization itself sets the stage for ideas, right? In its human-centeredness, it's about understanding human needs, it's about designing so that you can respond to those needs, and then it really brings equity to the forefront, or that indigeneity, that inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice. So now that we've gotten a better grasp of knowledge mobilization, let's talk about the role of visual arts in all of this. So we're going to talk, throughout the remainder of the presentation about the different forms that you can use in terms of conveying the information, storytelling through your visuals, but we'll also talk about the purpose and the impact, and not just the role of visual arts, but your role as well in communicating those visual arts as well. And we'll highlight a lot of those things and some of the frameworks that will support that. So I'll just link it back a little bit in terms of knowledge mobilization and its purpose and its impact. We go down that path of knowledge mobilization because it informs decision making by synthesizing and disseminating evidence-based knowledge. It improves practice and innovation by facilitating the transfer of best practices, lessons learned, and innovative solutions, right, leading to those improvements in professional practice, service delivery, and product development. And then it empowers those knowledge users by engaging them in the knowledge mobilization process. It empowers them to contribute their expertise, perspectives, experiences, leading to more, inclusive and effective solutions. It enhances that accountability and promotes transparency by making research findings and data accessible to the public and encouraging the accountability among researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And it maximizes the impact of research by bridging the gap between research and practice, ensuring those valuable insights are generated, through research are translated into actions that benefit society and health systems. And then lastly, it fosters innovation and societal progress by facilitating the exchange of ideas, knowledge, and expertise. So knowledge mobilization fosters that innovation and contributes to the progress. And you got to think that visually, like, that's a whole new avenue that expands the purpose and impact of knowledge mobilization. So at its core, knowledge mobilization plays that crucial role in bridging the gap between research and practice, empowering knowledge users, informing decision makers, driving positive change across various sectors and communities. And again, we can take this to a whole new level visually, to be able to meet audiences and knowledge users where they're at. And within that avenue of doing it visually, there's a plethora of products and approaches that we can use to do this. And we'll kind of unpack this a little bit as we talk about, again, the role of visual arts and then your role in selecting and actualizing your knowledge mobilization products as well. So, I mean, there's illustrations, there's comics, there's infographics, digital storytelling, and more. There's several different audiovisual approaches to it. It really opens up the box of how creative you can get. What we're going to distill out of this is really like, what are those key messages that you're trying to get across, and what are the needs of the audience, right? So, yes, a lot of these can speak to various ways that people like to be engaged. So you definitely need to take that into consideration. And it's okay to think outside the box a little bit. Again, you want to put the focus on your audience. So when and why to use graphic illustration. And I put in there a really important thought, as in, just because you can doesn't mean you should. um, Yes, we are talking about arts-based modalities here, and it's exciting, it's creative, it's a different way to go. But again, you got to temper that with what are the audience needs? What are they looking for? Yes, you can do something really cool, something really visual, but how are people going to respond to that? Is that what they're looking for? Um, sure, we want to be able to push the envelope a little bit, but we can't lose sight of who we're actually doing this for. So when you're aiming to reach a broad, diverse audience, you do want to keep it very focused. Sometimes you got to simplify it. You got to engage with people and make sure, again, that you're going to meet them where they're at. So we'll actually talk about the difference between what's arts-based research and then what's arts-based knowledge mobilization, because there is a difference. Arts-based research is where art is not simply an add-on to the research process, it's the primary way of examining and understanding experience. So it's embedded throughout the research process. It includes art and design elements within the research process and the research text. Engagement can happen in every stage. Every stage can be visually represented. Again, to always consider if that's the best option. So you do have to decide that early on in your work if you're going to use the full-on arts-based research approach or just kind of scale it back a little bit to the arts-based knowledge mobilization. And then, of course, throughout that research process, you're always taking into consideration the audience and the message. There's a great quote from acclaimed filmmaker Pete Docter in The 6 Rules of Great Storytelling, as told by Pixar. So what you're trying to do when you tell the story is to write about an event in your life that made you feel some particular way. And what you're trying to do when you tell a story is to get the audience to have that same feeling. You take that and overlay it with the research process, you have to connect that all the way throughout. What's the feeling? What are you trying to connect your knowledge users to throughout every stage of that research process? Arts-based knowledge mobilization, on the other hand, may or may not include arts in all steps of the research process. So the arts are used to facilitate the co-production of knowledge among knowledge users in the knowledge mobilization process, or it can be used to formulate what the products or those final knowledge mobilization products and dissemination avenues would be. It is creative, it's visual, it's human-centered, it's design-led. You really get to see that collaboration between artist, designer, and knowledge users versus like in the arts-based research, often the researcher is positioned as the artist designer in addition to being the researcher. But you'll see a little bit more diversity and engagement across arts-based knowledge mobilization this way, and that collaborative environment really leads to improved knowledge mobilization. Again, why you would use this particular form is it enhances understanding and retention of information between the different knowledge users. It stimulates those emotional and cognitive responses and facilitates that deeper engagement. So now that we've talked about that difference between arts-based knowledge mobilization and arts-based research, we can now talk about how do you craft those engaging visuals for your research or your journey. So we'll go through some tips on identifying core messages and selecting those appropriate visual forms and what are those best practices. So there's a simple selection criteria you can go through when determining, is this the best approach to use that arts-based approach to your knowledge mobilization? Identifying goals and target audiences, right? So you want to think, what are the goals of your arts-based knowledge and mobilization efforts? And how are they best tailored for each target audience you hope to influence? You want to choose product types, mediums, and methods for examining impact, right? So what product type and medium are appropriate for your research topic or question, the goal, the target audience, and why. You want to build partnerships for the co-design and production. of the work, right? So who might be interested in partnering with you, who's from the arts community, or again, like what's your role in terms of, are you the primary arts-based researcher? Are you collaborating with others? What are the needs of everyone that's involved? And then you don't want to lose sight as well of the tracing of that dissemination and the impact of arts-based and knowledge mobilization. So what are those methods and impact indicators that might inform your arts-based knowledge mobilization efforts in relation to your goals? Messaging is also very important, right? You want to consider what's going to create a clear message visually for you. Um, uh, it's George Reed, John Lavis, and colleagues actually wrote a paper many years ago, actually, that gives us a really good basis in terms of what are those key questions you should ask when you're trying to communicate your research. You want to think of with what message. So what are you communicating? What counts as good evidence that you want to include in your visuals for your users? What is the take-home message that you want to encapsulate? To whom are you communicating visually? So who needs to know about the work? Are they ready to hear or see this particular message? By whom? Who is giving the message? Is that person the best source, right? Is credible, non-threatening to the audience? So whether it's being delivered by a champion, whether it's being delivered by a well-known artist or somebody that's recognizable to help get that message across, what are the time or resources needed to develop that message, right? So we're not just thinking of crafting the message, but the physical form that it might take in terms of your audiovisual components or that arts-based modality that you're using. And then with what effect? What is the end goal um, of doing all this? Again, kind of links back to just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Make sure that you're very focused in that. And then how, right? So there you want to focus on interactive engagement. What technology or infrastructure is needed to create your visuals? What does the audience use or prefer? You have to think very carefully about their context. So for example, if you have individuals in a rural setting that may not have the devices or means to access like digital versions of the work that you're trying to convey, then you may have to go with something, say, that's more paper-based, art installations, things like that, that are more accessible to them and speaks to their context. So again, like what is the audience context that facilitates engagement with your arts-based knowledge mobilization products? Thoughtfully engaging your knowledge users with your messaging and your products in the research process will clearly communicate what you're conveying with the work. And then it also helps ensure that the research that's being translated through this is meaningful, relevant, and impactful. So we can often think about it in terms of what are those barriers, to that you got to get past when you're thinking about, is this arts-based modality the best format to use? I like to simplify it in terms of like particular barriers to those communications are people don't know about it, they don't understand it, they don't care about it, or they don't agree on its significance. So you look at that, ask yourself those questions, and then you can answer or respond appropriately with curated visuals to overcome those barriers and facilitate bridging those gaps. So if the audience doesn't know about the information, you want to develop an arts-based product that's going to be engaging and generate interest. If the audience doesn't understand, um, then you want to create products that are clear and credible to help people understand that. So those often require having to simplify the visuals. If the audience doesn't care, you want to be able to demonstrate the knowledge in those visuals as being meaningful and relevant so that you can obtain buy-in. That one gets a little bit trickier at times. And if the audience doesn't agree, you want to encourage the buy-in and perspective shifts by making the evidence compelling and engaging. So you really have to drill into what their contexts are so that you can tailor the visuals to meet those needs. Your voice and style is also going to be very important. Um, you have to consider in these visuals, they're going to speak to people on different levels. Are you using your voice? Are you using your perspective to get across? Are you presenting your views or are you representing somebody else's? And that's where you have to be very careful when you're presenting somebody else's view or a collective view, right? If you're presenting things on behalf of other knowledge users, you got to make sure you're all on the same page with that particular one. So you can really see where engagement becomes very important, even in conveying that voice and that style. Uh, I like to look at it as you know that you're very clear with your voice and your messaging, because then people can just pick up on that right away. There's no ambiguity, there's no confusion. With that, it just comes across nice and clear. Some of the other best practices and universal principles when it comes to communicating visually. Right. I mean, there's the general principles of design. There's things like color theory, composition, typography that speaks to different moods and emotions that you try to convey. Materials, equipment and tools are very important to consider. Again, what is the modality that you want to use? What is the context for the audience? So again, speaking to that example of something in a rural setting where somebody can't access something digitally, you want to use an analog format, or it's something that's more tangible for them. You have to think what fits within your resources and your budget is also important. Format size and sharing is again important. So even thinking about uh, an installation that's really big, sometimes you got to think, well, how do I even get that through from one door or one space into another space for an installation? You know, is it a post or something that could be easily rolled up and transported? Is it a file size? Is it a website, something that's, say, running a lot of videos, eating up a lot of data in the streaming that's just not gonna operate smoothly when people try to access that information? Are there really big files or PDFs or something to download? You do need to take those into consideration when you're developing your products. Organization of space and tone. You hear, you know, less is more. And that's true in a lot of senses, right? You want to not overcrowd, you don't want to overwhelm. Often it's best to keep it simple or start simply and again engage with your audiences, your other knowledge users, and see what's that happy medium that you can strike with it. Hierarchy, you want to guide people visually through um, through whether it's the image, the artwork. So hierarchy, you know, will have a clear structure of what's sort of biggest to smallest, so that visually people can follow along with it. You kind of don't want to have things dispersed all over the place and people get lost just trying to follow, well, what's the pattern that I need to move through here to get from point A to point, or sorry, the starting point to the end point of the information that's conveyed. Grids and gestures help to keep things aligned, create visual harmony to the work. Shapes, icons, and style, you want to take that into consideration as well. So if you're using shapes, make sure they're not going to dominate the work, right? You want to have good visual to text balance that also occurs when you're using shapes and icons or trying to generate that style. You don't want to jump around all over the place in terms of that. Like, say, for example, you have a lot of softer edges, rounded elements. You don't want to break that up too much by something that's very angular in there, because then again, visually people can get confused. through things like that, it's like, well, okay, are you trying to give a softer feel to the visual, or are you juxtaposing all of a sudden all these angles? Where are you taking people's attention when they're viewing this work? Copy and attribution, make sure that you're giving credit to everything, whether it's your own visuals in there, whether it's the contribution of anybody else's, even for your icons. If you're pulling icons from the internet, you do need to have a caption or a caption legend at the bottom of the work that gives full attribution to where those visual elements are coming from. Color as well. So I mentioned color theory earlier. Do be careful with the color that you're choosing for your work, whether that's accessible enough, right? So you need to use colors that are distinctive enough. There is actually the color wheel for colorblind individuals that are viewing the work. That's something you always want to have a peek at to make sure there's enough contrast between the color so that people can see and distinguish between different elements. You want to make sure that the opacity of your color saturation is strong enough as well so people can make distinctions between the different elements, right? Whether that's between your text, whether that's between your visuals. You also want to choose carefully the colors and the mood that they convey. For example, for Indigenous works, orange is an appropriate color. You want to be careful with the use of red for particular things. Like you could be talking about, say, birthing experiences in the hospital, but you're using red, makes it seem like it's more traumatic than it should be. You might want to go with, say more pastel colors, something a little softer, and less intimidating for people when they're engaging with your visuals. Words and lettering, you want to be really thoughtful about your typography and the readability of the fonts that you choose. So you don't want to pick something that's got a lot of like cursive to it. It might be hard to distinguish. Nowadays, people prefer sans serif, and in digital media, sans serif and more block letters are easier for individuals to read, easier on the eyes, and especially as we age and it becomes a little bit more tiring to read cursive letters, you can reach a broader audience by picking more block printed text. Oops. And then accessibility. So again, you want to check on visually the accessibility. You want to make sure that your text is large enough, there's enough contrast so people could see it clearly, that it's readable and legible. And then, of course, there's lots of templates out there. There are lots of great websites that'll help you check some of these elements as well, especially for accessibility. So there is a online accessibility checker that's free to use, and you can put in your font colors there. You can put in your text, and it'll help you determine, this meets the global accessibility standards. And just to go through a really quick checklist here in terms of your products should be for targeted audiences, products should be simple, products should be focused, have that visual to text balance, should be easy to promote, must be easy to view, should be manageable length and size. Products should not be overcrowded, have appropriate titles and citations. So again, give credit where it's due, and then take into consideration your flow and your style. So I know I've probably inundated you with a lot of information and boxes to check off when you're thinking about, okay, like, how do I put together these visuals? Well, not just that. In terms of constructing the visuals or even engaging in the process of developing the visuals, there are evidence-based frameworks that can help you, right? Whether you're in doubt about what you're doing, whether you're struggling through it, looking for something to guide you through, or those lessons learned and earlier successes to other projects. So one of the great frameworks that are out there was developed by Dr. Tina Kukkonen. And It's the four-stage arts-based KT framework for researchers. It's a great planning framework. It's a simple formula to navigate, especially if you're new to arts-based knowledge mobilization. This is a great framework to kind of help you pull everything together and walk you through the process. More recently, the Science Communication Institute came out with the Scientific Visualization Framework. This is very useful, especially if you're developing visual guidelines for yourself in your research. This discusses the steps, the sample activities, the skills that are needed. What are those bright spots and pain spots in the process? It speaks to that iterative nature of this type of work. And it's really good for walking you through like visual storytelling and then engaging, especially when it comes to your artists or your knowledge users that are playing any artistic role in the process. There's also a framework by Tavares and colleagues. This one is really good because it focuses on relationships and collaboration. So one of the sticky points when it comes to arts-based knowledge mobilization is the fact that, you know, you'll find that artists and researchers seem to live in different worlds, and like, how do you bring those two together? So this framework is really good to help you kind of navigate those relationships and the collaboration. It gives you methodologies, because again, too, art is not viewed as the same value as science. This is just the reality. It's just the honesty about what it is being an artist in, you know, like a academic realm. It's getting better, but we'll talk more about this, and I'm sure many of you may have a lot of questions later on about that too. But this framework offers evidence-based approaches and a framework for including arts-based knowledge users and modalities in both the research results and the practice. And it is an innovative approach for representing data through comics in particular. So an actual comic was developed out of this in terms of liver health. So now we can kind of dovetail into those key considerations and challenges when it comes to working in arts-based knowledge mobilization. So yes, what does it mean to be an arts-based researcher? When you define this, it helps arm you to face some of the challenges a little bit better. The International Forum for Visual Practitioners actually recently came out with this particular model of competencies for being an arts-based researcher. So it really talks to that like that composition of and connection of that emotional intelligence and management, the expertise, the skillfulness in both basic and facilitative skills that are needed to be able to do this work effectively, because doing the work is one thing, but you yourself have a role to play in this. Or these are the qualities that you could be looking for if you're working with other artists or arts-based researchers or knowledge users in the project. So in terms of the emotional intelligence, you know, you're looking for that self-awareness, right? You're looking for that ability to be present, right? To maintain focus on the current moment and refocus attention to remain present, self-management in terms of reactions, biases, energy management needs, cultural competence. So possessing the ability to respect, appreciate, and interact with cultures or belief systems often different from one's own, and unbiased listening, right? So you can listen and capture people's expressions without altering content or ideas. That domain of know is that expertise in terms of professionalism, excuse me, and the knowledge to support the process and delivery of the product. Professional attitude, adaptive anticipation, so the ability to anticipate and adapt to all other knowledge user needs, professional growth in terms of building and maintaining professional knowledge for continued growth, and then the skillfulness, right? So the basic skills in terms of being legible, drawing skills, and it doesn't even have to be that great drawing skills, but just are you clear with what you come across with, even if it's stickmen, if people can connect with the stickmen and know what the stickmen are trying to do, that's really like the basic drawing skills that you would require, or just being able to put together shapes just to convey meaning and the message. Preparation, understanding the range of tools and materials needed for each type of engagement. And then more advanced dimension would be group-oriented capture, right? To manage time and space for capturing information according to the group's needs and know how to build and visualize an agenda. And then facilitative skills in terms of like being able to lay out your information, hierarchy, pattern recognition, visual communication, documentation skills, things like that, that we covered in some of those more universal design principles. And we can sort of bring it back to some key points. It's similar to the checklist, but this one has a more knowledge mobilization general process focus rather than just the product focus. So you want to look at the detail, who is the audience, why you want to engage with them, and the message that you want to share. You want to identify the importance of the research or the work for both your knowledge users and what you intend to do with it. So again, clarifying the goals, the audience for each planned element of the visual. You want to keep it flexible. It's a very iterative process when you work in arts-based research or being able to illustrate your research. So you do need to kind of go with the flow. Be practical about it too. And again, give credit where credit's due, and also credit yourself for the work too. Evaluating communications is also really important, because to be honest, this is a newer branch to knowledge mobilization, and there's not enough, or in my opinion, enough evaluation that's done on it, or it's still kind of emerging. And it's really good to develop that evaluative spirit as you kind of venture into the foray of arts-based knowledge mobilization. And if you can establish that really early, you're always going to get that really helpful feedback. You're going to be able to see the impact of what you're doing. And that's really important to carry through, whether it's for the future work that you're doing or for others that are trying to grow this field as well. Some of the other challenges that are faced, and I mean, I've touched on some of them, but ethical considerations, right? So the equity and inclusion, ensuring that your visuals are culturally sensitive and inclusive, having those appropriate representations. I've done work where, particularly when you're working with Indigenous groups, between language and then visual representations, it's very different. There's not representations in Indigenous artwork that are synonymous with a lot of the icons and general media that we've grown accustomed to. For example, icons appear very westernized, whereas they don't have symbolism in their culture that quite meshes with that. So it's like, well, how do you navigate that? What do you do? It does require a lot of engagement, getting to know like what do they value in terms of those visual representations, and you kind of got to carve out or create your own sort of visual style and approach to it. And I do have some examples I'll show you as well. Navigating intellectual property rights and collaborations is a big challenge, right? Protecting your work, protecting the work and rights of others in the work that, in the visuals that you're conveying, does get tricky. academic rigor and integrity. So as I mentioned before, like there's that whole arts versus science thing. People or many audiences don't see art as having the same integrity as, say, like scientific representations itself. But yet art is becoming more of a bridge to connect different audiences with the academic work. There's the overcoming barriers in terms of resource constraints, finding skilled collaborators, addressing the gap between researchers and artists, and those collaborations. So again, you can fall back to those frameworks that'll help with that. Sometimes remuneration in all of this, whether you're an academic or whether you're an artist as well, can be a bit of a sore spot when it comes to this. So those are definitely conversations you'll have to have. And then sustainability. One of the things that's not thought about a lot is the sustainability of artwork, right? In terms of where do people pick up where you've left off? How do they continue with that? Is it just like a full stop with the work that you've disseminated, or how does that then open up the doors to other possibilities? You do need to establish strong visual rules that are easy for people to connect with. And again, you can rely on a lot of those universal design principles and often not overcomplicating things to create that connection. We'll also talk about AI because we have to talk about AI when it comes to these things. There's positives and negatives to it. I mean, AI draws from the full expanse of the internet, right? And it's that garbage in, garbage out concept. So you do need to vet anything that you go through it. I do find AI helpful for inspiration. In terms of helping to create visuals, it's sorely lacking. It's not developed to that stage yet, but there are some beneficial uses to it. For example, I was working on a project for visual for children with medical complexities in their families in terms of their inpatient experiences of care. And I, initially put together the visual on the left, and I'm like, well, how do I make this a little bit more exciting or more visually appealing to an audience? So I had it run through the AI, and it gave me something that was a little bit more textured. So then I kind of used that as inspiration to create this particular piece. It has been adapted a bit more since then, but at least it gives you a general sense, like sometimes when you're stuck of where do I go with this visual, or how can I refine it a little bit more, then a tool like AI can be helpful. And we'll quickly go through some examples so that we have some time for questions and answers afterwards. I'll talk about graphic medicine briefly for any of you that have heard of it, but it is a modality that actually is very arts-based research. Dr. Nick Susanis and his work is a very good example of graphic medicine where like all of his research is done in comic format. There's nothing that's like your typical paper when it comes to that. And it's also helpful. Like there's illustrations. These are ones that I've done for a chapter on a book that's coming out on graphic medicine. And it kind of like gives you that basis of how do you do qualitative research? How can you incorporate that and think through doing your research visually from beginning to end? In terms of arts-based knowledge mobilization, there are products like your conference posters where you can really push the boundaries of that and engage with audiences in a different way. You can use visual devices like anthropomorphism, for example. So even Kim is an anthropomorphic character. Even from the previous poster, there's the sick earth, right, to demonstrate the impacts of climate change. There are visual summaries as an example, and these ones in particular uh, are very tailored in terms of the ethical and contextual considerations for them. So they're very much based on the audience, and this strongly influence like the color, the visuals, the representations. This one was an Indigenous piece that was done on intergenerational trauma. And this is where I ran into a lot of roadblocks in terms of, well, how do I represent things meaningfully in a graphic recording or graphic illustration that captures the essence of what was conveyed in this presentation, but without diminishing it through overly westernized representations. So this was what I constructed that was based on a lot of Alex Janvier and his work, because he's a very well-known Indigenous artist. And then even for the Honoring Life project as well, this one was heavily influenced by the students, right, and their particular backgrounds. And I tried to capture that in this particular graphic illustration, right, even incorporating the flags from their different First Nations heritage, the colors, the very nature, more natural elements to it, the continuous line art, right, as a means to connect it, that all stems from the smudging in the bottom right of it. So lots of different elements to tie it all together. So yes, this is another means of using it as a teaching tool, actually. So graphic illustration as a teaching tool. And then we can finally conclude, because I know I've probably opened the fire hose on you guys with all the information on how to go about illustrating your research. But just a quick recap. Hopefully through this presentation, you've seen like the power and the validity in arts-based knowledge mobilization, when to use it, and some of those frameworks to help you through it. Then, like keeping your audience's context in mind, not just in equity and knowledge inclusion, but just, again, I always use that phrase, meet people where they're at, which really sums it up, like it's a give and take. It involves that engagement, it involves those conversations, and you got to work with your knowledge users to find that happy medium. And then again, we've gone through some of those frameworks, approaches, and solutions to doing the work. So by following all these strategies, you can harness the power of visual arts to create more impactful and meaningful dissemination of your work, and just be able to illustrate your research. And then all the references are there, and my contact information as well. And we have a few minutes for questions and answers. I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions, and hopefully everybody's able to kind of hang around as well, and happy to engage with you all about the material.